When it comes to selling products on Etsy, intellectual property law is not something that you want to mess around with. Just because something looks old does not mean that it's free to use. And trust me, the consequences for getting it wrong can be catastrophic. Which is why I make one of these videos literally every single January, to educate, to arm, and to stop common misconceptions. Because every January, we get a fresh batch of classics entering the public domain in the United States. And as of January 1st, 2026, a handful of very recognizable characters and stories from 1930 are officially in that mix. So grab your coffee, because today we're talking about what officially entered the public domain as of January of 2026, and how Etsy sellers like you can legally use these works without accidentally stepping on a copyright or trademark infringement landmine. For those who are new here, my name is Starla Moore, founder of the Handmade Alpha Academy for Etsy sellers and manager at erank.com, Etsy's most popular SEO tool. And today we are diving into the public domain class of 2026 with a focus on 4 that I know are going to get Etsy sellers excited: Nancy Drew, Betty Boop, Pluto, kind of, and Flip the Frog. However, before we start, let me hit you with the disclaimers. 1. I am not your lawyer. I am an Etsy educator. So use this as educational info, not legal advice. And when in doubt, always consult with an actual IP attorney. 2. Public domain laws are country specific. I'm talking about the United States today, so if you sell internationally or manufacture internationally, you need to be mindful that public domain status can be different in different places. And 3, this is the one that matters most for Etsy sellers, when something enters the public domain, it does not mean every version of it is suddenly fair game. What becomes public domain is the original work from that year. Later redesigns, later stories, later branding, and modern adaptations can still be protected. So always stick to the earliest versions and avoid those later redesigns. Also, quick bonus disclaimer, trademark still exists. Even when a character's earliest appearance is public domain, companies can still enforce trademarks in ways that affect how you market your products, like using a character's name in a title to imply official origin. So your artwork may be allowed, but your listing presentation can still get you in trouble if it looks like you're treading on an official brand. Okay, now the disclaimers are out of the way, let's get to why you're really here. First up, we've got Nancy Drew. And I know if you're anything like me, your brain immediately goes to the iconic Nancy Drew that you've seen on modern book covers, reprints, box sets, and TV adaptations. But in 2026, it's the earliest versions of the 1930s classic that are now in the public domain in the United States. That means that you can legally build off the original 1930s story and the character as she exists in those originals. And that is huge for Etsy sellers, because Nancy is basically the blueprint for cozy sleuth culture long before we started calling it that. Vintage mystery, bookish aesthetics, detective vibes, moody old house imagery, secret staircases, coded messages, maps, magnifying glasses, typewriters. There is so much creative runway here. But here's the catch. Nancy Drew is a series that's been edited, revised, reprinted, and modernized a million times. So if you're gonna create products inspired by Nancy Drew, you want to anchor yourself in the 1930s text, not the later rewrites, not the modern cover art, not the newer branding that became popular later. A safe way to think about it is, if it feels like the version that you grew up with in a modern bookstore, treat it as suspicious. Go back to the earliest source material and pull your inspiration from there. So what can you do with this practically as an Etsy seller? You can create vintage-inspired bookish merch that leans into the theme of the 1930s Nancy Drew world. Detective culture, old-fashioned clues, retro sleuth typography, mystery club vibes, and original text excerpts where appropriate. You can create art inspired by public domain elements from the earliest books. You can create designs that communicate recreate classic detective girl energy without copying any later protected visuals. And I know you guys probably want to use the text Nancy Drew everywhere. Just remember the trademark disclaimer. Being allowed under copyright law and being safe on Etsy are not always the same thing, because Etsy takedowns are often driven by trademark enforcement and automated reporting by IP owners. So just be smart about how you market it. Next up, we've got Betty Boop. And as I'm sure you've probably already guessed, Betty Boop is the biggest 2026 headline that we have for public domain entry. But there's a reason that I'm continuously going to repeat the words earliest version. Because what entered the public domain is not every Betty Boop that you've ever seen. It's Betty Boop as she appears in her earliest 1930 era material. And the earliest Betty Boop is different. If you've ever seen the super iconic, flirty, polished, classic Betty branding that people recognize instantly, you need to be careful, because early Betty is very different from the licensed products that we see in stores today. OG Betty wasn't even known as Betty, which means that the name Betty Boop is still protected along with her iconic depictions. Instead, in 2026, we now have the ability to use the earliest depiction of what would later become Betty, from the very first cartoon of the Talkatoon series by Dizzy Dishes. This version of Betty looks a bit more puppy dog-like, with floppy ears and a filled black nose. Chairman and CEO of Fleischer Studios, Mark Fleischer, recently posted this official statement. The Betty Boop character and brand, with worldwide name and imagery recognition, will continue as a protected global ambassador for Fleischer Studios and its licensees' entertainment content, merchandise, and other goods/services and activities. Which is a really nice way of saying that they're watching us. However, as long as you're careful, this is the perfect opportunity for sellers who love retro aesthetics, the 1930s jazz club vibes, vintage pinup silhouette styles, old animation textures, and black and white illustrations. So when you create, build from the earliest public domain versions only. Keep your visual references anchored in that 1930s style, and let your visuals do the talking. Because yes, the more that you drift into the iconic modern Betty, the higher your risk gets. Now, let's talk about Pluto. Kind of Pluto, but don't use the name Pluto. In 2026, the earliest 1930 era appearance connected to Pluto enters the public domain, but Pluto doesn't necessarily show up as Pluto the way that you think of him today. In some of those early appearances, he's basically just a prototype, sometimes referred to historically as Rover, and not presented with all the later personality and design traits that Disney built over time. Even the name Pluto is off limits. So what does that mean for you as an Etsy seller? It means that you can't just slap a picture of modern Pluto on a mug and say, yeah, public domain, baby. What you can do is reference the earliest public domain depiction and the specific cartoons from 1930 that are now public domain, sticking to the look, the context, and the visual language of that era. This is one of those cases where the safe version is gonna look a little more vintage, more rough around the edges, and probably less like what the average shopper expects. And yes, I know that's a harder sell at first glance, but you know what else is hard to sell? A takedown notice. Also, with Disney properties in particular, you should assume trademark enforcement is aggressive. Even if you're using public domain material, how you title and tag the product can matter. Inspired by vintage 1930 animation is a very different energy than Pluto shirt. And finally, we have Flip the Frog. He may not be as mainstream as the others, but that's exactly why I wanted him in this video. Flip the Frog is a classic early 1930s cartoon character tied to that rubber hose animation era, and his earliest cartoons are now public domain. So if you're the kind of seller who thrives in niche internet culture, vintage cartoon aesthetics, retro animation oddities, or I want something different from what everyone else is doing, Flip the Frog is an option that many sellers may not be aware of. Because every year, Etsy sellers pile onto the most recognizable public domain thing, and within weeks, the market is flooded with the same basic designs. But when you pull from a deeper cut like Flip, you're more likely to stand out, especially for the vintage cartoon enthusiasts. With Flip, your safest play is to lean into the public domain cartoon styling itself. The vintage line work, the expressions, the motion style, the classic black black and white palette, and the early animation style. And again, stick to the earliest sources. Don't use modern reproductions, modern logos, modern remasters, or someone else's cleaned up art as your reference. Go back to the original public domain material. Now, I want to end this with the part that I say every single year because it's often the part that people forget. Public domain does not mean free for all. It means you have permission to build from the original work that is legally expired copyright protection. And the smartest Etsy sellers use public domain as a creative foundation, not as a shortcut. So if you're going to do Nancy Drew, do it in a way that feels like a love letter to 1930s mystery culture. If you're going to do Betty Boop, do it in a way that honors the earliest rubber hose era designs, not the modern commercialized version everyone recognizes. If you're going to touch Pluto, do it with extreme caution, anchored in the earliest public domain appearance, not the later version. And be mindful of trademark risk in how you market. And if you want a niche opportunity that most sellers won't be aware of, Flip the Frog is sitting right there waiting for the right creative brain. Obviously, when it comes to Etsy, it's not enough to just have a fun product idea. You also need to be strategic about when you launch it, how you market it, and how you plan your year so you're not just scrambling every single season. And every January, I do the hard part of planning a 12-month marketing schedule for you, for free. This free PDF contains a 12-month printable set of calendars to help you plan ahead for holidays and popular seasons. Plus, each month has personal tips and pointers from me to help you stay ahead of your competition. You can grab my free 2026 marketing calendars right here somewhere and in the link down below. Until next time, Pookie.